The morning after an unprecedented double resignation, the BBC's head of news insisted that allegations of bias levelled by a former external advisor and leaked to the Telegraph were untrue.
I stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with me. But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased. That's why it's the world's most trusted news provider.
Deborah Turness stepped down along with the BBC's Director General Tim Davie, leaving the organisation rudderless just as it gears up to renegotiate its funding model. Over the past week, the organisation had been silent in the face of a document leaked to the Telegraph newspaper written by Michael Prescott, a former Sunday Times journalist and PR boss brought in as a part-time editorial advisor. He said he'd written and sent it to the BBC's board in despair at inaction from bosses when issues came to light. He criticised the organisation's coverage of trans people, which he said suppressed gender-critical views, of racism, which he said was inflated, and BBC Arabic's coverage of the war in Gaza, which he claimed had an anti-Israel bias. But it's an edit in a Panorama documentary on Donald Trump that has become the most controversial.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you. And we fight. We fight like hell.
That last sentence about fighting was edited in from another part of his speech 50 minutes later, and instead he'd said this.
We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them.
Michael Prescott said this materially misled the audience and suggested Trump incited the Capitol Hill riots. He's backed by the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who put him forward for an Ofcom role in 2021 and said he'd refuse to pay the licence fee until Director General Tim Davie resigned. Responding last night, Trump posted on Truth Social, "The top people in the BBC, including Tim Davie, the boss, are all quitting/fired because they were caught, inverted commas, doctoring my very good, brackets perfect speech of January the 6th. People should just watch GB News instead," his press secretary said.
We'll be watching. We'll be ready. Because it's the pursuit of truth that gives us our calling.
It's an uncomfortable spotlight the BBC is now under as it tries to expand stateside in an unprecedented media environment, with the US president bringing lawsuits against several networks. The BBC is reporting that the Trump administration has threatened legal action. The debacle has also put a spotlight on the BBC board, of whose 13 members, 5 are political appointees and have been accused by some media commentators and former editors of political interference. The board was given, BBC journalists reported, an apology statement to release by the news division, but refused to publish it, some saying it didn't go far enough. Instead, the board went to ground, stuck in deadlock, until last night's shock resignations. Today, in the fullest statement yet, the BBC's chairman wrote to MPs apologising for the edit in the Trump documentary, but said the allegation that complaints in the memo were not acted on and the implication that the organisation sought to bury them was simply not true, with corrections, clarifications and disciplinary action taken. He said the BBC was responsible for thousands of hours of outstanding journalism and that it was important to maintain a sense of perspective. Earlier, I spoke to Ben Bradshaw, a former MP and Culture Secretary under Tony Blair, who also happens to have had a career as a BBC radio journalist, and I asked him what he thought had been going on.
Well, it's a complete mess, and I'm afraid the BBC has partly itself to blame, but it's not the only culprit in this whole situation. I mean, the BBC's been terribly bad historically at putting its hand up when it gets things wrong and saying, sorry, you made a mistake, and rectifying it quickly and explaining what happened and dealing with the people who were responsible. We've seen that time and time again. But on the other hand, over the last week, the BBC board has been incapable of either approving a letter, it seems, to apologise for the Panorama clip, while at the same time being completely incapable of defending the BBC's overall journalism and its commitment to impartiality. That's not a sustainable position for the BBC. The board is clearly divided. paralysed, dysfunctional, whatever you want to call it. And the government now needs to step in to make sure we have a functional BBC board that can operate, that can make the BBC face up to its errors, but also defend the BBC against its enemies and detractors.
And so how would you do that? If you were in power now, what would you want to see happen?
Well, the Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, aided, I hope, by the Culture Select Committee, need to find out exactly what's been going on the board in the last 7 days, because it seems from the reports that both Tim Davie, the Director General, and Deborah Turness, the head of news, wanted to apologise, quite rightly, for the Panorama clip. Completely unforgivable the way that was done. It was a rookie error. Every journalist knows you can't put two separate bits of an interview together to make someone say something completely different from what they said. They should have apologised for that quickly. But it seems that there was some on the board, and don't forget the board has party political appointees, including several appointed under Boris Johnson and the previous Conservative government, who didn't think that went far enough. And it seems they wanted to adopt the whole premise of this dossier by the former Sunday Times journalist Michael Prescott, accusing the BBC across the piece of institutional bias. And I think quite rightly, Deborah Turness was not prepared to do that. And I hope neither was Tim Davie. So they went. It's a completely avoidable departure, in my view, but it's the board's fault because the board has been completely hopeless at doing its job properly.
You mentioned there allegations from supporters of the BBC that this was somehow staged by a board stacked with political appointees.
Yes, I wouldn't go so far as to describe this as a coup, as some have, because it doesn't seem to me that anything is over at the moment, apart from the fact that the BBC has lost a very able Director General and a very able head of news. But no, I mean, there are clearly political appointees, and this is not some kind of state secret, who were appointed to the BBC under Boris Johnson, who've been trying to steer the BBC in what they regard as a non-anti-woke direction. They think the BBC is woke. It's riddled with liberal lefties. Actually, you get the left complaining about the BBC and Palestinians complaining about the BBC just as much as you get the right and the Israeli government complaining about the BBC. The BBC's job is not to follow the editorial line of right-wing or left-wing newspapers. It's to provide the licence fee payer with what it's paid to do, which is objective, fair, impartial news and information. That's the job it does, by and large, extremely well, which is why it's the most trusted news organisation in Britain and probably also in the world.
Nevertheless, there were serious allegations in Michael Prescott's memo. I mean, do those hold true for you? Do you think they're false?
Well, I think the problem here is that some of them probably do hold true, but others don't. And the BBC, because of the paralysis on the board, was not able to come out and say, oh, we're sorry for the mistakes we made over the Trump edit, for example, but then to defend the integrity of the BBC's journalism in the other areas. I mean, this memo was written by a former Sunday Times, which is a Conservative newspaper, journalist put into the job under a Conservative government. If you read the paper itself, it's full of his own prejudices and his own views as to why he thought but other people might take a different view. That's the whole point. And the BBC's job is to be objective, impartial, balanced.
But isn't it the truth that politicians of all persuasions have perpetually put pressure on the BBC in the hope that it might sort of nudge it into giving them favourable coverage? Isn't that a problem that the BBC has had for time immemorial?
Yes, you're right. But what I don't think has been the case at any stage before are politicians appointed to the board who have ran a campaign, if you like, internally to try to shift the editorial position of the BBC in one direction or another. It's not the BBC's job to have an editorial position. That's the whole point. It's newspapers' job to have editorial positions. The BBC is supposed to be impartial. And it seems to me quite obvious that one or two members of the board who were appointed under the last government have made it impossible for the BBC board to do its job properly. And that's something that the current Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, is going to have to address.
Can I just step in and ask who you mean when you say those two names, two people?
Well, Robbie Gibb is somebody who used to work for the BBC. He then became a Conservative political advisor. He was appointed to the board by Boris Johnson. And there's far too many different layers of management in the BBC, which is one of the reasons they're so bad at admitting to mistakes when they go wrong.
Would you have done anything differently to Lisa Nandy in all of this?
It seems to me that the statement Lisa Nandy put out on Sunday before the resignations were announced was perfectly reasonable. And it seems to me also that the resignations took her by surprise. I don't know how much she knows about what's been going on the board in the last week, but if she doesn't know, she needs to blooming well find out now and sort it out.
And finally, what next for the BBC and who next? Who's going to want to take over this job? Would it be a poison chalice?
Well, I'm not sure. And it is an almost impossible job to do. And one of the things that the government might want to look at, along with the BBC board, is separating the job out of Director General and Editor in Chief, because it's far too big a job for one person. I mean, we're talking about this crisis in the BBC a week after it had the highest ratings for a live TV programme for many, many years. For celebrity traitors, something getting figures that nobody thought was possible anymore for terrestrial television. If the public really thought they were going to lose the BBC, there would be outrage and enormous concern about that. But the government, I think, needs to step in now to ensure that we have a functional board of the BBC, because over the next 2 years, the future of the BBC and the licence fee is going to be discussed. And I don't want that to become a party political football. I think we should do everything possible we can to avoid that.
Ben Bradshaw, thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.